Hell's Kitchen is polished now, gleaming glass towers, rooftop bars, and quiet tree-lined streets. But beneath that calm exterior sits one of New York's most violent legacies. Once upon a time, these same blocks were ruled by the Irish mob, a criminal network so brutal and loyal that even the mafia treated them with caution. This is the real story of how the Irish mob took over Hell's Kitchen, how they rose from immigrant poverty to organized power, and how they finally fell. The roots stretch all the way back to the mid-1800s, when tens of thousands of Irish immigrants arrived in New York fleeing famine. They settled in a patch of Manhattan's West Side between 34th and 59th Streets, close to the Hudson River. It was one of the roughest districts in the city, tenements stacked with families, open sewers, and a skyline of smoke. Jobs were scarce, and discrimination was constant. For the Irish poor, survival often meant bending or breaking the rules. That's where Hell's Kitchen's gang culture began. The earliest Irish gangs were neighborhood crews, small, local, territorial. The most famous were the Gophers, active from the 1890s through the 1910s. They controlled much of the West Side under a loose hierarchy led by men like Oni the Killer Madden and Thomas Terrible Tommy Enright. Their rackets included extortion, burglary, labor strong-arming, and control over dockside theft. When Prohibition hit in 1920, the Gophers saw opportunity. They started running liquor along the Hudson River and dealing with bootleggers across the city. But by the 1930s, law enforcement crackdowns and the Italian-American mafia's growing power pushed most of the old Irish outfits aside. Oni Madden himself left New York for Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he reinvented himself as a businessman. For decades, it seemed the Irish gang's time in Manhattan was over. But Hell's Kitchen had a way of breeding its own replacements. By the 1950s and 60s, the neighborhood was changing again. The docks still employed thousands of longshoremen, many of them Irish-American, and the unions that represented them were ripe for manipulation. Loan sharking, gambling, and labor racketeering flourished. The man who controlled it all was Mickey Spillane, known around the West Side as the gentleman gangster. Spillane wasn't like the old Prohibition thugs. He was quieter, more calculated. He ran a network of bookmaking operations, loan shark rings, and union kickbacks, all while maintaining a kind of street diplomacy. Spillane kept his territory Irish and independent. He refused to let the Italian mafia, especially the powerful Genovese crime family, fully cross into Hell's Kitchen. That decision earned him both respect and enemies. By the 1970s, the city's underworld was shifting again, and younger, hungrier men were rising. Chief among them was James Jimmy Coonan, a kid from Hell's Kitchen who had grown up idolizing gangsters and despising Spillane's old-school restraint. Coonan was violent, unpredictable, and ambitious. Where Spillane had played politics, Coonan preferred war. The conflict between the two men defined the next chapter of Hell's Kitchen. Coonan and his crew began targeting Spillane's allies. Shootings, kidnappings, and ambushes tore through the neighborhood. Spillane's hold weakened as Coonan recruited a group of Irish toughs who would become infamous as the Westies. The name came from their turf, the West Side of Manhattan, and from the press that began covering their crimes. The Westies were a small gang, maybe 15 to 20 core members, but their reputation for brutality far outweighed their size. Their enforcers included men like Francis Mickey Featherstone, Billy Beatty, and Eddie Comiskey, all of whom were known for their violence and loyalty. Coonan understood something Spillane never embraced. Alliances mattered. Instead of resisting the mafia, he aligned with it. The Westies struck a deal with the Gambino family, then led by Carlo Gambino and later Paul Castellano. In exchange for a cut of Hell's Kitchen's profits and help in labor and union rackets, the Gambinos gave the Irish mob a seat at the table. That partnership turned Hell's Kitchen into a fortress of organized crime. The Irish handled enforcement for the Italians on the West Side, everything from debt collection to murder contracts, while continuing to run their own loan sharking and gambling businesses. Coonan himself modeled the gang after the mafia: initiation rituals, coded language, and a strict hierarchy. But the Westies were less disciplined and far more volatile. Their violence was personal, often messy. They became notorious for dismembering victims to avoid identification, a tactic so extreme that even other gangsters kept their distance. Through the late 1970s, the Irish mob's control of Hell's Kitchen seemed unshakable. The neighborhood's working-class roots and tight-knit community gave the gang cover. Locals often saw them not as criminals, but as protectors, men who kept outsiders and rival gangs away. The police presence was thin, corruption was high, and the waterfront unions provided both employment and silence. But power like that never lasts. The same brutality that made the Westies feared also made them reckless. Featherstone, one of Coonan's closest lieutenants, became increasingly unstable after years of violence and heavy drinking. After being convicted for a murder he claimed he didn't commit, Featherstone turned informant. His testimony became the key that unlocked years of secret killings and racketeering cases. In 1986, federal prosecutors used the RICO Act, a law designed to dismantle organized crime networks to bring down the Irish mob. Jimmy Coonan, his wife Edna, and several members of his crew were convicted of racketeering, extortion, and multiple murders. Coonan was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict ended the reign of the Westies and effectively closed the book on a century of Irish gang dominance in Hell's Kitchen. After the trials, the neighborhood changed quickly. The piers were redeveloped. Real estate investors moved in. By the early 1990s, Hell's Kitchen was transforming from a blue-collar stronghold into one of Manhattan's fastest gentrifying districts. The Irish bars that once served as gang hangouts became trendy pubs and cafes. What had once been a no-go zone for outsiders turned into a symbol of New York's renewal. Still, traces of that violent past linger. The name Westies remains shorthand for the old Irish gang days. A few of their children and grandchildren still live in the neighborhood, remembering a time when you didn't call the cops. You called someone who knew the West Side. Old-timers still recall the docks where deals were made and bodies sometimes found. The Irish mob story is often framed as a rise and fall tragedy, but it's also a reflection of how New York itself evolved. Each generation of immigrants brought both ambition and desperation. In the 1850s, the Irish fought just to survive. By the 1920s, they were running bootleg whiskey. By the 1970s, they controlled unions, gambling dens, and whole neighborhoods. Their power grew in lockstep with the city's corruption, and their collapse came when New York finally began to clean itself up. Today, walking through Hell's Kitchen, it's hard to imagine that the same streets once echoed with the sounds of gunfire and sirens. 9th Avenue was once lined with Irish taverns and butcher shops. Now it's sushi bars and boutique hotels. The docks that fueled the gang's empire are long gone, replaced by parks and luxury buildings. But if you look closely, you can still feel the weight of history. Some of the old brick buildings still stand, their facades pitted with decades of grime. A few neighborhood bars still hang photos of Mickey Spillane or Jimmy Coonan, reminders of when the Irish mob ruled these blocks and no one crossed them. The story of the Irish mob in Hell's Kitchen isn't about glamour. It's about survival, loyalty, and power. It's about a community that rose from poverty, found its strength in the shadows, and paid the price when the light finally reached them. For nearly a century, they shaped New York's underworld as much as any mafia family. And though the Westies are gone, their legend remains, etched into the streets, whispered in old stories, and buried beneath the glitter of the new Manhattan skyline. Because in Hell's Kitchen, every building stands on layers of history, and some of those layers are stained in blood.